Welcome, everybody. Another episode of the Transform Your Birth podcast. And today I have with me the beautiful Em. And if you're hearing little baby noises, that's little Em's daughter, who's how old, Em? How old is she?
9 weeks.
9 weeks old. And she's got another son, Joseph, who is how old?
Just turned 2.
Just turned 2. So 2 and 9 weeks old. And I'm really keen to talk to Em today because she's had 2 births, and it's wonderful to experience women sharing both stories because we always learn so much from one birth to the next. And Em's second birth, she made very different decisions as a result of the first birth. So let's kick off. And Em, just tell us a little bit. Let's go back to baby number 1. Tell us a little bit about how you were in your pregnancy and what sort of preparation you did during that time, and how you felt about coming into having your first baby.
Yeah, so my first pregnancy, I had a great pregnancy, and I was obviously, I was so excited about becoming a mum. I'd always wanted that, and I sort of am an older mum, and so I really, I suppose, appreciated that I was just in that moment and that opportunity. And I sort of grew up with a lot of women who spoke so beautifully about birth, particularly a great aunt who's had 15 children, and so I was always surrounded by that, and so it was something that I was really excited by in terms of experiencing pregnancy and birth. In terms of making decisions and just preparing for birth, probably the first decision I had to make was around the care option, and so being in a regional area, I asked a few different people about and particularly even just family members, what sort of path they took. And so we basically had 2 options. We have the private option where I would choose an obstetrician, and there were 2 obstetricians to choose from locally. And then there was the public option, and we have actually we're in the midst at the time of a brand new hospital being built. But navigating all of that, there was so much to learn and to find out. And I did find it difficult just even finding the information. It was when I spoke to people, they'd say, oh, I went through the public hospital, or I, had this obstetrician and she was amazing. So I had private health insurance. And when I looked at the 2 options, the deciding factor for me was basically continuity of care. And the only option, if I wanted continuity of care, really was to go through the private model. And so for me, I was kind of fairly open-minded and thought, look, I think it would be great to build a relationship with someone. I know that knowing my personality, if I get to know someone, that's the person that I want to see when I'm in that moment of birth, a familiar face and someone who sort of knows a bit about me, and we're we understand what's important to me, I suppose, in that moment. So that's the option I took. And then in terms of the preparation, so basically that model then was, very structured in terms of they tell you what it looks like. It's regular appointments once a month. When I got sort of a bit further down the track, and obviously I had a couple of conversations with you, Chase. You told me about your course. That was something that I was really keen to do in terms of birth education. And that was, obviously I had no idea what to expect, and I really wasn't aware of what sort of birth education options there were out there. I obviously assumed, growing up with your mum and things like that, there's always been hospital and prenatal classes and things. But so after talking to you, I knew that was something that I wanted to explore. So I did your course. And I think I did that, obviously it was around that sort of 30-week mark. And I really came away from that course, obviously that for me filled in a lot of the gaps. And you obviously go into your first pregnancy quite naive, but it probably also reinforced a lot of my natural instincts around, that this is something that I really believe that our bodies know what needs to be done walked away from that, just it reinforced that excitement and that I suppose hope for, you know, what birth is all about. I think the biggest thing in doing that 2-day course was having my husband come along, and I think that was probably the biggest thing. That was the time that we actually, you know, he came along to a lot of my appointments and things like that from the beginning. But in terms of the actual birth and what we were stepping into and being on that same page as a partnership, that was a really significant time, I think, to just have that time together and have conversations and just really consider what it is we're about to step into.
Yeah, you don't know what you don't know. And I find that also during the weekend programs that couples sort of come together on the same page and knowing really clearly what each role is and how significant each role is, helping partners to realize that they're not just tokenistic bystanders, but they have a real role to play. Once they get clear about that and they understand the process, they understand how to read birth, they understand what sort of tools and things they can do to help her to find comfort, then she can actually relax and let go and feel like, oh, good, you've got me covered. And that's a really big shift, I think, in preparation when you've got partners who, you know, don't just feel like they've been sidelined, but are actively engaged and walking through that doorway into parenting together side by side with both feeling like you've really worked to get this baby here. It's one of the biggest feedback I get from my program is that, gosh, my partner was amazing. And thank goodness they understood and knew how to help me, because I don't think I could have spoken up for myself and things like that. Yeah. So that's great. Put you both on the same page.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and look, probably the other thing in terms of that preparation, I did prenatal yoga, which I loved, and I've always loved yoga and things, but and it was during COVID, all of that. So then that moved online. So that was different. And look, that whole preparation, even in terms of being pregnant during COVID, that was an experience. But in all honesty, I didn't know any different. So it didn't affect me too much. And the only other thing I'd say, as I went throughout that pregnancy and obviously I had that private obstetrician, there's no doubt I did have times, many times, I think, where I did find that the relationship I was developing with that obstetrician challenging.
Yeah.
And I think even more so after doing your birth course, where I reflected on the fact that there were things I wanted to have discussions about, and I really struggled to open up conversations with her about, you know, what was important for me in terms of, you know, labor and birth. And there was basically, to be honest, there was no opportunities to have those conversations. And I certainly struggled to have the confidence to be able to kind of push more on that. So I really, in the end, I kind of just went along with it. And I really went through a lot of thought patterns of, oh gosh, I don't want to be that difficult person. And you know, she's done this so many times before. I need to just trust her. And this is obviously what it's like. And you know, so I knew that I should have asked more questions, or I should have pushed back and really made sure that the conversations were about me and this baby, rather than what I found in my experience. Many of the appointments where you sort of go into the appointment, it's very, you know, lots of just general chit chat. They do a scan and she'd basically just say, this is what we're doing, this, and this. And you kind of like tick a few things off the list and then send you on your way.
Yeah.
So I did struggle with that in terms of the preparation and just building, I think, a solid relationship with someone and being able to open up some deeper conversations around the actual birth and what I should expect and whether she was on the same page as me. So that was something that second time round I was much more aware of.
Very different. It's interesting, Em, because you went into that model for the continuity of relationship, and yet your ability to develop that relationship sounds like it wasn't quite able to happen. I mean, the reality, a lot of doctors, they see a lot of women over that month, and the appointments are often very small, and they often don't have time to get to know you and who you are and what's important to you and how you're approaching that. And to be fair to doctors, the pressure is on them to get it right. So they tend to manage the process more than ask you what you would like, although it'll always depend on the individual doctors. But it's helpful for people to know that, when you get continuity of a known doctor, you're getting continuity of someone who can come in if things get complex. And knowing your doctor can be very reassuring and can help women to feel safe. But it sounds like in your case, what you were really after was a relationship, and for your voice to be heard and to be able to have conversations so that you felt you're on the same page. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was the biggest thing. It's obviously what I was wanting, and in the end, I didn't feel as if I had a voice.
Yeah.
And
Right.
if anything, it made me question things and internalize a lot of things. And I think the other thing was then the conversations I was having was all I was getting was a lot of feedback around things like, the positioning of your baby, or make sure you're doing this, or your iron levels are at this, so if anything, I was sort of just taking those pieces of information, and I think that did, in some ways, it was like I was getting lots of feedback that I'd just take away with me, and I wasn't quite sure what to do with that.
Yeah, right.
And in some cases, I think it also made me sort of a bit hesitant then about, is my baby in the right position, for example, and worrying a little bit about, as we got closer to that time. And probably when I say positioning, that was a thing for me, because I was, told pretty early on, your baby's breech. And I think then all of a sudden I went down that path of, is my baby, and then I was a bit focused on when is it meant to turn and that kind of thing. And I think, probably in that third trimester, then I was a bit focused on a lot of those things, rather than just trusting that, there's a process that will that what will be us. Yeah. So it was kind of like, I think a lot of that information that I was receiving along the way was making me sort of a bit nervous, if anything.
Yeah. Not all caregivers are sensitive to what they say and the impact it can have on the pregnant woman. I often talk about that there's a great focus on what can happen, and this, and then this could happen, and this, and we keep an eye on this. And meanwhile, all of those potentialities get stored in that woman's brain, and she thinks, well, how would I deal with that? And when we focus too much on the what and not on the how, we're sort of leaving women in an ocean without a life raft. It's like, well, what would I do if that happened? And how would I manage that? And so when something's a little bit every day for your health professionals, they forget about the impact that can have on a very, emotionally attuned mother whose emotional feelings are being turned up as she comes into readiness to be a mum. We're designed to have more emotions in order to be able to read and attune to our babies. And so we're very vulnerable, actually, in that space. So let's fast forward now to Joe's actual birth. Tell us about that.
So look, I had, I went into spontaneous labour. My waters broke actually first the night before his due date. And it was the only time that I wasn't expecting anything to happen, because everyone tells you it doesn't happen on your due date. And if anything, I did have an obstetrician appointment planned for my due date. And I actually, by that point, I was gearing myself up. And I'd even, written a bit of a script about the conversation I wanted to have around induction, because I knew that would be something that would be the first thing that she'd broach with me. And so I was really adamant that, I wanted, I didn't want to be dictated to about, this is when we're going to induce you, etc. So, and I'd sort of done a fair bit of research around that and was really clear on what I wanted at that point. So that's the headspace I was in. So when my waters broke, I was probably surprised. But at the same time, I'd been doing sort of like listening to a lot of your reportings and, like the birth rehearsal and things. And, you know, I was really, like, I am generally a relaxed person. And so when my waters broke, that was exciting. But in many ways, because that was the first thing that happened, I was all of a sudden, you know, okay, oh, this is happening. I did, though, take on board all those things that you talked about, you know, where I went back to bed. I sent my husband, I said to him, you know, go back to bed, get some rest. But basically things did, my sort of contraction started probably about 2 hours later. I called the hospital because they'd said, you know, that's the first, if your waters break, you know, do that. And so I did call them. And the first thing they said to me when I said, your waters have broken, was that you need to come in straight away. Mm-hmm. And that caught me off guard because I wasn't expecting that. And my plan was always to stay at home for as long as possible. And I knew that for me, being in my own space was the best place for me to be. So I straight away did go through that sort of, oh gosh, do I do what they're telling me to do, and or do I just sort of wait and see what's possible? And I did ask them questions and say, can I stay at home for as long as I can? And they said, look, no, our policy is that you need to come in. So look, I actually got off the phone and I said to my husband, I said, I'm just going to wait till the morning, and you know, that they might call me and say, where are you? But I think I'm just going to wait it out. And I did. So I tried to rest where I could. My contractions did sort of get a bit more intense as the night went on. And about sort of 5 a.m, I woke up my husband and said, I think we should go in. And if I hadn't been told to go into the hospital, there's no way I would have, but I definitely had on my mind throughout the night that, you know, I'll just wait it out for as long as possible to the morning, but they've said I should go in, so I better. And that's definitely that part of me that's, you know, I am always used to doing the right thing and following rules. And it just didn't, I really had that feeling of like, oh, they've told me I should do this and I'm not doing it. So I certainly went in sooner than what I would have if I hadn't been told that. Anyway, we made our way into the hospital. They were great. And at that point, you know, I was still like very early days and everything was very manageable. But it was nice just to hand over my birth plan and have a chat to the midwives. And I hadn't met any of them at that hospital before. And they had no other women sort of birthing or anyone in the birth suite, actually. So they actually just left me to my own devices. And basically things throughout the morning from sort of 7 a.m. onwards, just we set up our space and we had, you know, just dim lights and we had music, and I had my headphones in, and a lot of it was actually just playing some of your tracks. I was very much in my zone, and my husband was great. He was, so it was sort of everything that we sort of envisaged it could be, particularly in that sort of hospital setting where they sort of just left us alone. And then I remember at about sort of 9:30, 10, the midwives came in and said, your obstetrician said she's going to be here at 11 to check you. And even that, I remember that point because that's when I looked at the clock and I thought to myself, and things were sort of intensifying, and I really wanted to hop in the bath, and I thought, I'll wait till 11. So everything came about this 11 o'clock, and I kept looking at the clock. And it definitely took me out of that zone a little bit. And then when my obstetrician, she came in, and there's no doubt by this point mentally I was, you know, the biggest thing I was nervous about was her presence. And I'd got myself into that space of, I know that an obstetrician is only there, you know, for the birth and when things go wrong, and they're there to sort of keep you safe. And really she's not going to be part of that labour much at all. So I'd sort of got myself into that space. But that in itself, you know, in hindsight, I should have probably done something about that rather than thinking in that way. But so she came in at 11, and the first thing she did was turn on the lights, and she sort of said, let's get this party started. That was the exact line.
Oh, she shattered the environment. Oh,
yeah.
My goodness.
And I remember the midwives and even my husband, they were like, shh, you know, like, anyway, and I just watched this tussle. Like you could tell they were trying to protect me. And she was sort of, you know, quite dismissive of that. I remember I came out of that space then, and I actually said, please, shh. But straight away, I then was sort of a bit burred up, I suppose, in that, kind of I felt like someone had sort of, basically changed that space. And from there, things changed, because she asked me to get up on the bed, and her whole demeanor seemed quite like, how dare you to sort of tell me what to do type thing. And it's really how it felt. And then I was feeling really tense about that. And she did a vaginal examination, and there wasn't a question about, do you want me to check you or anything? And again, as I did throughout my pregnancy, I'd just gone along with that. So I was just like, oh, okay, this is what we're doing. And I'd been told at 9:30 that I was getting checked, and she did that vaginal, and it just, I remember it was painful, and it was possibly even my whole headspace. I was tense, and I said, please stop touching me. And I started to get emotional, and I really, things started to unravel there, where, I didn't want her near me. And even just that whole examination just didn't feel right. It felt rough. It didn't feel gentle. And look, I know even when I debriefed my birth, it was that moment that really had the biggest effect on me. Like I felt that, I wasn't being cared for in that space. And I really went into a whole space of fear. And I remember saying, after that all occurred to the midwives, I really unraveled. I was emotional. Every contraction that came about, I was just, I couldn't catch my breath, and I was just starting to basically get quite fearful about the obstetrician coming in and touching me again. And my headspace was just, everything was just about, I remember, literally like crying, trying to get my breath and saying, I don't want her to touch me again. And everything became about that. It was challenging. The next few hours, basically, I was holding on for dear life, and I was emotional, and I was, and they were just trying to really get me back on track, and they couldn't. I did get in the bath, but it was too much, and it just wasn't the space I wanted to be in. And really, and then even my husband, I could tell he was rattled too, and he didn't know how to sort of get me back on track. And there was a point, and I was in this whole space where I basically lost all confidence. And he said, I'm just going to leave you with the midwives. And I know, and we talked about it following, that he had good intentions. He was sort of saying, and he did say to me, maybe I need to leave you with these women, and they can, they're skilled at this. And so he left, and he said, he just went outside to take a breather. But for me, my whole reaction to that was, I was feeling fearful, and all of a sudden, even my husband abandoned me at that point, and I didn't feel safe in the environment I was in. I didn't feel safe with all these people. And then my one person that was there to protect me walked out of the room. So it really, I literally just let them do what they needed to do from then on. So as the birth went on, I think by about 3:00 I was begging for an epidural, and that was, I just went down that path of, please just give me an epidural. And they, tried to sort of say, on your birth, would you like the gas? Would you, and they just said, please just give me the epidural. And look, within half an hour, they had an anaesthetist come in. And that definitely, that helped calm me, and I sort of relaxed a bit. But it was patchy, and I did have just one patch that I could feel everything. And in many ways, I found that even harder, because I was on my back, I couldn't move. And prior to that, that being active was just my one release. So then I was on my back, and all I could, just feeling this one area, and it was just literally, I was just looking at the clock. It was, and then they came in and checked me again, the obstetrician. And look, at that 11:00, I forgot to mention, she said her first thing was, I'm concerned about the positioning of this baby. He's not in the right position. And so everything became about the positioning. And so when she came in, at 5 o'clock to check me, I was 9 centimeters, and she said, you know, you're going to have this baby in the next hour, but I'm not prepared to deliver him. His head isn't in the right spot. I'm not feeling. And I remember just saying to her, just do whatever you have to do. And I just had tears rolling down. And I think I'd already in my mind knew that it was going to end like that. And I'd gone down that path already. And I think I'd already, you know, it was a fear of mine, obviously, in pregnancy, because she'd talked about this positioning thing quite a lot. And I think I was sort of thinking I was a bit too focused on that. So look, then we went in for an emergency Caesar. And that in itself, it was challenging. Gordon, my husband, he was tired by then as well, but you know, it was all very quick then going into that caesarean. The baby he wasn't in a good position, and he was stuck. And look, for me, I obviously had no idea, you know, what was going on, and I was really just surrendering by that point. But I think that was the part that my husband probably he experienced, just watching everything that unfolded in that space, where the obstetrician was quite concerned about the baby at that point, and they were trying to get him out, and it was difficult to get him out, and the whole sort of procedure was fairly intense. But look, so he came out safely, and you know, I was a bit out of it after that. But from then on, you know, we had a healthy baby. I had he fed beautifully on my boob for 2 hours. But in many ways, I think I was a bit of a shell. Like, I was just sort of in a bit of a haze, like, what's happened. And it was, yeah. So I really had to process that. And I did over the next few days. And thankfully had 5 days in hospital, in a private hospital. And that's the part that I'm grateful for, where the midwives were beautiful. They gave me a lot of time, and they recognized very early on that I needed to talk through my birth and ask a lot of questions. And I think it was on the second day after I had him that I was very teary when the midwife came and asked a question about something about the birth. And she sent in the midwife that was actually present at my birth and to talk to me. And she sat down with me for about an hour and a half.
Wow.
And that really answered a lot of my questions. And look, even my husband, we talked as well, and he answered questions for me and helped. We talked through things about what he witnessed versus what I witnessed, and he helped me, you know, sort of piece it all together. So there was definitely a process we went through there.
It's amazing. How does it feel to talk about it now, Em?
Look, to be, you know, I have talked about that birth quite a bit, you know, even over the last 2 years, because as different things, as you experience different things, it obviously you can you go back to that significant experience. I did a debrief with you, and it was the best thing I did, and I'm so grateful for that, because that really helped me hone in on some of those significant points that were traumatic. And that's the thing. It wasn't the cesarean that was traumatic. It was that moment of that first interaction and that first examination that was the most traumatic point of, you know, and that really was such an emotional thing for me, and something that I had to work through. But I think I feel like I've processed so much of that. And I feel like even having a second pregnancy and this second birth really allowed me to delve in and reflect on that even more, and to use that experience. And gosh, I learned so much from it. There's so many things I took out of that as a person and into my world as a mother. And then stepping into that space of my second pregnancy, if anything, Trace, by that point, I think I'd processed so much. I felt really comfortable with the fact that I've addressed a lot of those things, and I can acknowledge that those traumatic parts of that birth. And it actually it instilled a bit of fire in me, where I was just so determined to make sure that did not happen, and not that, but I did things on my terms in the second time round. and that I took back my power, I think, and I really focused on developing my own confidence and being, you know, being confident in my own instincts and really trusting that and knowing that I'm the one that actually knows what needs to happen with my own body and where I'm at and really, putting myself in the driver's seat rather than allowing people to do things to me and me sort of just going along for the ride.
Yeah. There's a beautiful evolution that happened inside of you, Em, as a result of that birth. I often say no birth is ever in vain, particularly when we can do what you've done, which is to process it and take back or reclaim what it is that potentially got lost by taking the gift and the wisdom from every birth. And I just love how you've described that. Thank you so much for sharing that. So going into now your little girl's birth, tell us about what was different in that preparation, pregnancy, and then coming into the birth. Share that.
Well, the biggest thing was choosing my care provider. And I did struggle in the fact that there were limited options available in where I live. But I tried not to, just get too caught up in that because that's out of my control. And that was the biggest thing, is I was prepared to focus on what I could control. I had many conversations with people, and it was another thing that because I was frustrated that, I almost went down a path of, why didn't women tell me this? Like, what have been other people's experiences around here? And why haven't I had more women around me within this sort of region talking to me about, the different experiences they've had in different sort of systems? So, look, I really was proactive in exploring that. I came to the conclusion that the midwifery program through the public hospital was really, a lot of people said the midwives are just wonderful. And although there's no continuity of care, it seemed to be that I think that approach with the midwives was something that I thought that would suit me. And I also chose to go down, so I did shared care, and so I went to a GP who specialises in obstetric care and is also a sonographer. So that was the element of continuity where I could actually, even with my scans and things, just go to the same person and have someone to talk things through with. And that was ideal. So basically, the midwifery program through the public hospital was fairly structured. I had, I think, 4 appointments booked in with them. I had to go through the Vbac program. So because of this, I was aiming for a vaginal birth after caesarean. But the GP that I had and that I chose, he was fantastic because he was quite familiar with that particular hospital and all of their policies. I was able to say right from the beginning what my that I was aiming for a Vbac and talk through my first experience. And he really helped me in preparing me for conversations I could have with those midwives at those appointments. He helped me, as I sort of did my own research around Vbacs and risks and those kinds of things, to really, put everything into perspective, to have questions answered, but also prepare myself for the fact that, they might really focus a lot on the risks involved, but allow me to sort of stay in my own zone and not get sort of too drawn into any of that. And look, so with that pregnancy, there was a few things along the way that I was really comfortable with the care options that I'd chosen. But I think the biggest difference was it wasn't necessarily even that experience. I think it was even the way I went into each of those appointments. I was prepared that if I didn't want to go to an appointment, I wouldn't. When he asked, when they sort of go through, obviously you have sort of a schedule you have to follow. So, when they spoke about having to do your insulin and your diabetic test, whatever that one's called. I'm 37. I was 37 with this pregnancy, so I was considered geriatric. So then they say that there's more risk involved, and so you have to do 2 of those tests, and there's all these a few extra things that are just the GP's supposed to go through with you. But my approach to it all was I had a bit of a sort of structure around when they'd say, oh, we need to do this next, I'd ask them, what's the policy? Why do you have to do that? And they'd say, oh, well, it's part of, because you're 37 and these are the risks, we're supposed to do this with you. And I'd say I'd consider that, and then I'd decide whether I wanted to or not. And thankfully, both the midwives at the hospital and the GP were so respectful of that. And I really felt like I was making decisions that were right for me. And that meant I actually, when I got into my third trimester, and they recommend that you get more regular scans as you lead up closer to your due date, I actually cancelled a lot of those. And that was on reflection of my first pregnancy, where I think I was really caught up in a lot of noise. I was getting so much feedback that I actually wasn't listening to my own body. And with this pregnancy, by the time I got to that third trimester, I stepped into that space of, I don't need that feedback. I don't feel like I need a scan. I really want to listen. I can feel my baby. I really went in, I think, and I tapped into probably instinctively what was happening, where I was really starting to go within. I was doing yoga, and I was meditating and listening to just different things that helped me just reflect and process and be still and step away from even all the busyness of my life. And I really, as the weeks went on in that final trimester, I had no idea what position she was in. I didn't know whether she was a girl or a boy. I didn't know much at all, but I actually just felt really content, and I just wanted to trust in whatever will happen will happen. I wasn't set on, oh gosh, if I don't have a natural vaginal birth, I'm going to be so disappointed. I was prepared for, and that was a big learning from the first one, was that anything can happen in birth. And I was really comfortable with that if there's anything I learned, that who knows how it's going to all unfold.
Yeah.
But the biggest thing I wanted to focus on was that I will know how I need to respond, as those things are sort of thrown at me. And so I really did just go into that birth just in I think a space where I was just focused on within. And
Emily, your comment there about the noise that surrounds women and the monitoring and the testing, and of course, the flip side is it can help keep us safe. It can help us to understand things and know how to manage risk, and that is very true. But then there's also the other side of it, is trusting the mother, trusting the pregnancy, trusting the baby. It's a really fine line to draw, and I'm really fascinated by the fact that you stepped fully into trusting yourself around deciding what procedures, what testing, what noise you would open yourself up to or not. Did you have any sense at all that if something was wrong that you would know?
I did. Yeah, absolutely. I
Do you know
had
how?
so much confidence in that. No, I don't. And,
Where does that come from?
There was not one part of me that felt, oh gosh, what if something is wrong and I don't know about it? I really felt that and that was that really going within, that instinctively there would be a signal. I would know. And it was the best feeling, just feeling my baby, and just listening to my body and just enjoying that, rather than worrying about what could go wrong, and trusting that if something was wrong, that I would know. That, I think that in itself was so empowering, and that's something that felt so good and so different to, I think, my first experience, where I was really just guided by all of that input and probably feeling as if all of those things were needed to keep me safe, as if, that potentially things can go wrong. So
Mm.
It was a
I
whole
might
different
just
feeling the second time.
it's really fascinating to me how pregnant women, and we tease them about this, that pregnant brain, and you
Mm,
put your keys in the fridge, or you do silly things because your intellect kind of, and I always say the volume of the intellect is being turned down, but the volume of the emotional intelligence is being turned up, and that you use the word feeling a lot when
mm,
you were describing that. And I think that's exactly when it comes to tuning in, tapping into that deeper wisdom within all of us. It is a feeling. It's something that bypasses the critical conscious mind that's trying to assess risks and look at the evidence and look at the
mm,
stats, and all of that can sometimes inhibit, well, not sometimes, it does inhibit our ability to tune into a deeper wisdom and a deeper confidence that I've seen demonstrated countless times in women, less so in birth, more so in mothering. I can see it really start to rise its head in mothering as mothers tend to know if their babies, there's something not right. But that ability to tap into that wisdom is a conversation we rarely have. And it almost feels like that, as you described that first birth, that was your rite of passage into going through that doorway and then going, yeah, like the way you described, that fire got ignited inside of me. Um, that's such a powerful insight, and I hope people listening to this can get a sense of what it is that Emily's talking about, is that sense of inner knowing and inner wisdom, not thinking too much, but just feeling her way through it, cutting down the noise and starting to trust yourself.
mm.
Wow. So let's go to the birth now. Tell us about the birth of your little girl. It was a very different experience.
Yeah, it was, but similar. The day before the due date, my contractions started, and so
You're
if we have
on
a third
clock.
baby, I'll be expecting, which was incredible. But and look, my contractions started first this time, but probably, and I was prepared for for just staying at home, and that it could take a while to progress. But I felt really calm and in a good place when that sort of started. And look, in those few weeks prior to that, I definitely sort of had a few different sort of pains and things like that. So, and I loved feeling that, to be honest. My waters broke about 2 hours after those contractions started. And I did call the hospital and just at that point just let them know that my waters are broken and I'm in labour. But I was really confident. I'd already asked them what their policy was, that hospital, and I was really prepared for, what feedback I'd get at that point. But the midwife on the other end was just great. And I did say, I've got a toddler here at home, and this is the middle of the night. This is, I think, 2 o'clock in the morning. And I said, so I may come in a bit earlier, but we'll let you know when we're coming in. And she said, no worries, just take your time. After that phone call, I got into the shower and I, just was in a good space. But I was really conscious of my toddler in bed and that I didn't have anyone to care for him, and we're half an hour out of town. So I got out of the shower and I said to my husband, I'm going to call mum, even though it's the middle of the night. And she was expecting that call, and just give her the heads up and say that we might need her. And she answered her phone straight away. So she obviously was expecting the phone call. But and I asked her if she could come out to us, and she couldn't because she has a foster child she was looking after. And I said, that's okay. We might come in the next couple of hours and we'll just drop him off to you, and then we'll just head to the hospital. And so I got off the phone, and even though I knew I would have loved to stay at home, I was really conscious of him and what he needed, and I was really confident that, I just wanted to stay calm throughout the sort of process. So I said to my husband, I said, look, I think we might wake Joseph up and just take him into mum's, and then we might just make our way into the hospital. So we just took our time, and I just did my thing, and my husband started to get organised, and we left. We got him out of bed at about 4:30 a.m. and then we went in to town and dropped him off at my mum's, and she was wonderful, and he was excited to see her, and she just came and checked on me in the car, and I said, I said, I've got contractions, Mum, but I'm feeling good. It's very manageable. And so that was a lovely interaction. And then we made our way to the hospital, and I actually put my headphones in the car. And my favorite track, to be honest, Tracy, has some good feedback, is actually, I think it is at the birth rehearsal.
Yeah.
It's that for me is just the most calming, in terms of just almost like that, that vision of, just that, what. And so I just loved listening to that. And we got to the hospital, and my husband used to work there. And so he was very much, he was having a chat to the receptionist and things when we arrived. And that's a good point for me, in the sense that there was one thing that I did also focus on, was that in my last birth, I had so much hope pinned on him, that he used to be a paramedic, and he experienced birth and things. And I thought, he's going to handle this beautifully. And I was, and we had to talk through that first birth, and that, I did feel a bit abandoned, and that, and he struggled. He wasn't sure how he was going to handle that either, and had no idea what to expect. And so this second birth, we'd talk through things together, and I just said confidently to him, I just said, these are the two things I really need in birth from that first time. One, I really need affection. Don't feel like, even though that you don't want to touch me, because I might get, annoyed about that. I love that touch. There is just that helps me know you're there, and that loving touch is everything that I feel I need when I'm in labor. And the second thing I said to him is that don't leave me. I just, please don't leave me. And obviously I talked to him about how I wanted to go through this birth, that I, needed him to be a bit of a voice for me, and I was very clear this time round about what I did want and what I didn't want. For example, even like things like the examination. So I didn't, and I had to navigate that. Being a Vbac, they did have strict policies around monitoring and things like that. But I was, so there was things that I was actually saying I wanted to go against their policy on things. I did agree to continuous monitoring, but I said only if they had the mobile one available. And I said that I wanted, if I at any point decided that I didn't want that anymore, that was what I'd choose. And I didn't want any examinations throughout my labour.
Wow.
And I was, and obviously I knew that could change if at any point I felt I needed that. But, and that was something you gave me a bit of a tip on in terms of my birth plan. It was very specific, but I did go back and actually put something in there about that first experience, that I had a traumatic experience with one of those examinations, and that I really wanted to be cared for, and I wanted them to be gentle. And look, I handed over that piece of paper when I arrived at the hospital, and they never said another word about it, but I have no doubt that really helped them.
Yeah.
Because when I got to the hospital, the midwife that greeted me, she just talked to me, and she said, do you have a birth plan or anything? And I just handed it over. And she said she hadn't looked at it yet. And she said, do you want me to check you? And I said, I don't think I need to at this point. And she said, I don't think you need to either. Wow. And she just smiled at me, and they put me into a birth suite, and she said, do you need anything? And I said, I think I'd just love for us to be left alone for it. And she said, no worries. And she walked out, and it was dark, and honestly, I didn't see much of her at all. And I asked for a fit ball, and I just really tried to get comfortable. And I really was, at that point, my contractions were quite intense. But the biggest thing I think in that labour was, I definitely, in my preparation this time, like breath work and breathing were something that I was quite conscious of. And I know it's first time round, I'd had that, I'd practiced, I suppose. I knew what to expect, but there's no doubt that when I was labouring and going through those contractions, that breathing was and using sound when I was, at the peak of those contractions, I was just in this zone where my breath was, I was just on those waves. And I'd go back there again. Like it was the most powerful space to be in. And I felt the touch of my husband. I felt we were just in our little, space. And I didn't even know there was a midwife around, but I do remember at one point saying, I said to my husband, I think I want to go to the shower. And he's sort of helped me do that and things. And obviously I was getting close at that point, and it was a sort of a shift for me, because I sort of came out of that that real sort of flow that I was in. And all I remember, I was in the shower and leaning on the chair, and I was still in that zone of using my breath and just breathing into those contractions, which were, they were intense. And my husband using the shower head. And I remember I was just so direct in terms of needing a drink. I remember just being drink, or, I need that water warmer. And then I heard the midwife say, "Do you feel like you need to push?" And that was the first I realized that anyone was there, but I was still so in my zone. And I said no. And then, a little while later, it was probably only minutes, to be honest, I went, yes. And she obviously, this beautiful midwife, was just observing me from afar and knew exactly, it was like she knew exactly, and Gordon, he, relayed this to me, it's like she knew exactly where I was at just by watching me. And that in itself, so much credit to her, because the difference here was that there was I never saw a doctor. I had no one coming in and interrupting that space that I was in. And I think that was what was so different about this experience, was that there weren't any of those interruptions. And look, once I was into that pushing phase, then that was the hardest part of the labor, to be honest, because I hadn't done it before. And I found the shift from being that breath in working through contractions to then the difference of actually, pushing. And it took me probably, I think it was about 15, 20 minutes to actually adjust to that, and to that was a very different sort of energy that I had to put in, and even just feeling into that and what my body was doing and not resisting that. But we went through that. And look, again, that's when that midwife, she was more involved, because she did have to coach me a bit and encourage me to use my own body to move and trust, and not, resist and get fearful of feeling what I was feeling, and just to allow that, so that, that baby could do her thing. And but she did, and she came out, and it was incredible. It was the most, the biggest thing. I came out of that, and I remember calling you on that day. I don't know if you can hear that, but my husband's got the blower right outside my window right now. And I've listened to many podcasts before, but I swear that that's just like what happens the one time that you got something recording. But look, I remember they did everything that was on my birth plan, and that's the thing, I didn't have to communicate anything. It's like they really must have looked at that, and everything that I'd asked to happen happened. And she was on my chest, and then I birthed the placenta, and we spent probably 2 hours just with her on my chest and me feeding, and the midwife we just chatted about everything, and including my first birth. And look, I got very teary, and I thanked that midwife. I just said, thank you. I just thought she was amazing. And she is, she'll always have a special part, in my heart, because just of how and I just said to her, you were perfect for me. You did, you acknowledged and respected everything, I wanted and hoped for. She was everything that I could have asked for. So I'm so, thankful for that. But so honestly, I could not have asked for anything more, and it was a beautiful experience.
Communication is really important. And when you have caregivers who are not interested in looking at your plan, or not interested in looking at what's your birth map, or whatever you call it, that's really saying we're not interested in getting to know who you are and what's important to you. So I'd encourage people to really push through and make sure that they do take on board and to have a think about what is important to you. Not that you get fixated on it, but that you are letting people know just who you are,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
that point you mentioned about vaginal examinations, and when we talked about it, letting them know why that's so important to you can help caregivers do a bit of a double take on, oh, okay, that makes sense, rather than, oh, well, we just have to do it and it's part of the process. So I think that's wonderful. And for you to, you know, be able to experience a caregiver who is sensitive, who is listening to your voice, and who is prepared to support you to birth in the way that's important to you is just gold.
Mm.
That is an amazing story, Em. Both stories intertwined, connected, you know, inviting you to grow, inviting you to make your voice louder, inviting you not to be so polite.
Mm. Yeah, exactly.
You know, that those conditionings sometimes that we have as women, inviting you to make different choices
Mm.
and to be able to talk honestly with your partner, honestly with the people who you were working with baby number two,
Mm.
is what's really going to shift the whole experience. Is there anything else you want to finish up with, Em?
No, look, I think one of the biggest things I said at the beginning around I wanted to focus on what I could control, and
Mm,
even right down to, you know, the expectations on my partner. Um, I I went into that birth knowing that lots of things could happen, and there's so much you can't control in birth.
mm,
But that I was adamant, and I think this was a lot of even just meditating on this, that I wasn't going to react to things that were happening around me. So even if my partner, if he wasn't coping, because he's a human being as well, and
mm,
if you know, we sometimes have a lot of expectations, but at the end of the day, if they're struggling and they can't show up in the way that you need them to, that I wasn't going to react to that, and that I within myself knew that I had this
mm,
and that me and in my body would, no matter what sort of unfolded, that I could handle that. And I think that was incredibly empowering, and going into that birth, you know, I just didn't have any fear around those types of things, or a reliance on that, you know, I needed this to happen, or any, you know, it was that there's lots of things that can unfold.
yeah.
And the most important thing was that for me, I would just focus on, yeah, me and my body, and that I knew how to do this, and that we
Mm,
could handle anything basically.
yeah.
um, so yeah, that, and look, it was all of that learning is things I've taken into my life and my role as a mother. And yeah, it's, you know, obviously that's part of the growth, as you
Mm,
say. Being more you know, confident, and not being so polite, and trusting your instincts, they're all things that I just continue to work on and have helped me so much, I think. Yeah, as a mother and as a partner as well.
mm, beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing so much a part of you and how you changed through that process. And I think this particular interview has got a lot of wisdom just peppered through the whole thing. So I hope you've enjoyed listening to it and tuning in. And once again, we'll have another one next week. So great to be with you, and we'll see you again. Bye-bye.